Now which way do we go is the question to ask. There are so many choices that it's hard not to look past. What is real and what is fake, and the risk we have to take. Will we know what is throwing off our balance? We're trying to find ourselves without the defining words. We can no longer hold on to what only makes us hurt. We cannot sink into the dark. The vertigo is getting sharp. There's something greater than ourselves that we must reach for.
Coffee.
Hello. We would like to get started shortly. So people in the pizza area, if you want to start making your way to the seating. My name is Yuri Takteev. I'm the CTO of Rangle.io. I've been with this company for 4.5 years. And as some of you may know, this is a new office for us. So we're really excited to start hosting meetups here, and this is one of our first meetups. And we have started Rangle.io with this very strong, about almost 5 years ago, with a very strong focus on Angular 1. We have embraced React soon after it came out, and we're really excited now to about Vue, right? Like, there's a lot of exciting things that have been happening with this framework, and as we've been looking more and more into it, one of the things we've discovered not that long ago is like let's go attend Vue meetup, and there was none. So we decided that we should go ahead and actually organize one. So this is the inaugural Toronto VueJS meetup, and we are really excited by seeing such an awesome turnout for the first time event. So this is fantastic. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And we have two fantastic speakers today. One of them is our very own Evan Schultz, and he will talk about what does Vue offer to people who may be now working with different frameworks. And afterwards, we'll have Hassan Djirdeh from Shopify talking about the state management layer of Vue, Vuex. So both of those, I'm sure, are going to be super exciting topics. And I also wanted to mention a couple of other things. Right now on the screen, just disappeared. FITC is organizing a full-day event on Vue.js on March 3rd that we are sponsoring. There's going to be some fantastic speakers, one from Rangle and from a whole bunch of other places. And there is a whole bunch of other meetups that are also coming up in the Rangle space, so you'll see them coming by in a little bit. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Evan. Evan?
Hey.
Evan.
Thank you. I have your piece.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, so I'm Evan Schultz. I've been working at Rangle for about 3.5 years or so, and kind of over my career, like, I've been working with JavaScript for like a really long time. Back when we were at my first job, my manager told me don't use JavaScript because it was awful, and alert-based debugging in IE6 was about the way that you made JavaScript. So I've kind of gone through the pains of like IE6, to trying to like build my own framework that I then abandoned, to kind of being sold on Angular 1, worked with Angular 2 and React. And personally, I'm kind of really excited about the potential of Vue. And I'm just curious, is anyone here actually working with Vue on a work project right now? Lucky people. And here is kind of curious about Vue. Well, you'll hear, but kind of like want to try and like say sell it to your boss to actually adopt it. Smart people. So I'm going to go into what I think are some of the advantages of Vue. I'm going to try and avoid too much, framework war debates, because there are things that are just different and better or worse will depend on your pros and cons, but there are a few things that I do think that Vue just makes really, really nice. So why kind of consider Vue? And when I'm thinking about like trying to like adopt a tool either for myself or for a team, there's a few things that I kind of think about. One is kind of like the ease of use, the learning experience. Is it appropriate for devs of all skill levels and backgrounds? And also, is it appropriate where if you kind of know what you're doing and want it to get out of the way, does it get out of the way so that like you make framework go away? I know I got this. I know what I'm doing. And does the framework give you the ability to do that? And I think that Vue does provide those options. And I really think I could go into like every reason why I think Vue is worth at least taking a serious look at. But kind of keeping those questions in mind, my personal kind of short list of why Vue is first, it's a very focused framework. Vue does not try and solve every single problem that you might possibly maybe run into at some point down the line. Has kind of a bit of the philosophy of React in this way that it's largely focused on just managing the Vue layer of your application, and there's a bit of extra helpers on top that kind of ease the kind of say pain and complexity that you still run into with building applications. Also, I think Vue is a very approachable framework. It is really easy to get started with, it's easy to learn, and I find that it's kind of a very intuitive experience combined with like excellent docs, guides, dev tools. There's a certain kind of elegance to it that is really appealing. And the other thing that I like a lot is, and this is where I think Vue can make it easy, for me, easier to do kind of like things that are complex with the current tools that I'm using right now. There are certain things that Vue makes really easy that I'm kind of actually really excited about the potential that this opens up. And this is things like having like really highly dynamic data-driven UIs. And I'll go into more details on that later on in the talk. And my slides are slightly out of order, and I skipped one because I'm being lazy. But for lazy loading in Vue, either it be per like route or say per component, it's so easy, it's almost boring. And if you haven't felt the pain of trying to get lazy loading working before, and this is your first experience to it, you're going to be like, well, that just makes sense. And lazy. But anyways, provided that my slides were in order, I should be talking about how flexible and scalable it is. And I think that there can be the misconception because the tool is, say, easy and intuitive to learn, that you can only build easy things with it. And I think some people might have the misconception that Vue is just a toy framework. You can do a quick, like, hello world in a few lines of code, but wonder, can this scale to building real applications and solving complex problems? And I think that Vue can. So, talking about kind of, let's say, the focused nature of Vue, and in a interview with Evan Yu, not me, Evan Yu, the creator of Vue, I'm not talking in third person, he said that one of the reasons why he created Vue is because he was working at Google at the time and trying to do kind of like quick prototyping and that, and using Angular 1, and he was finding that there was just kind of all this extra stuff that was getting in the way of being productive and being able to kind of get work done. And he wanted to try and experiment with like seeing what would it be like to have a kind of really kind of Vue-centric declarative framework that kind of basically just did data binding and not too much else. And this is kind of what where I think Vue helps it a lot, because it is focused for kind of like, say, the core library on kind of largely managing the Vue layer of your application and providing kind of a few kind of like just enough extra helpers to make life a bit easier. It's not trying to solve every problem. And it's also a component-centric framework. So I think kind of like React has really proven that this kind of component-based approach, it works, it scales, you can build powerful and flexible applications with it. And in some ways, this is not kind of a new idea. Angular's doing it, Preact, Inferno. There's lots of like component-based libraries out there. But I think Vue kind of provides a very nice approach to that concept and makes it a bit more approachable than, say, React, because React is just JavaScript. And that is kind of a really big strength of React, but it's also a bit of the difficulty with React, where with React, if you know JavaScript really well and inside and out, then React is very good, and it has this very small kind of API that you have to worry about. But then trying to scale that up, it's nice to have a bit of helpers along the way, and a bit of that is enabled by kind of the declarative templates. And I'll go into a bit more details about kind of the templates and data binding. And there's kind of like pros and cons to templates. I've kind of, having worked with both like React and Angular and other frameworks, there's trade-offs to be made, and I think that Vue makes the appropriate ones, but also providing kind of the appropriate escape hatch for when you want it. And also makes data binding and reactivity really easy within your application. Kind of the basics of I have data in my component, is my view in sync, and I do stuff on the screen, does stuff update. And there's kind of just enough of a helper here that it makes it really easy, where you're not having to do too much extra like plumbing on your own, but at the same time not falling into the pitfalls that some of the earlier frameworks had run into. And if you've used Angular 1 and had like scope, digest, spider web of everything, touching everything and getting really confused, Vue does this in a smart way that avoids that problem. So kind of the basic blueprint of most Vue components is a template plus this. And this is kind of just a plain JavaScript object that has a very kind of lightly opinionated way of saying, well, here is what my component does. You have props, which is the input that you pass in, data, which manages your local state, methods, which are the things that your template can actually call, and computed, where if you want to put kind of like reactive data that will update in response to changes in their props or state. And this is kind of about as strong as an opinion that Vue will force onto you, that you must put your state into a data function, that you must put your methods into methods. And when I was writing Angular 1, I kind of found that a lot of my components and directives were kind of following a very similar pattern to this. Angular didn't force it onto you, but it was really easy to do bad stuff with Angular 1. And I kind of found it kind of interesting that this pattern is just kind of like baked into how you structure components with Vue. And it has all the other kind of, say, life cycle hooks that you'd expect, like before create, mounted, and kind of so if you're used to like Angular or React, those kind of life cycle hooks, they're available in Vue. They're not taken away from you, but I wanted to, at least with the idea of like that Vue is easy to approach, I think that is kind of an extra detail of complexity. I don't need to explain in depth the Vue component lifecycle. When you need it, it's there, it's easy to understand. Then the other kind of aspect is the focus on this kind of really simple declarative syntax, where you're able to have templates that look almost like HTML. There's a little bit of like the kind of handlebar style of templating for running text. But this is something where if you have kind of like a basic understanding of JavaScript and CSS and HTML, I think this is going to be fairly intuitive for most people to kind of look at and handle. And kind of along with this syntax, Vue also out of the box has scope styles. I should have like style tag under there, and because it seems like one of the challenges with writing CSS right now is how to remove the cascading from cascading CSS, either it be BEM syntax or putting exclamation important everywhere to override things because you've fallen into a weird like CSS hole. By having kind of scoped CSS work by default, it makes it really intuitive for people to start writing and styling components without worrying about impacting the look and feel of the entire application. So if you have a team with people that might not either say be CSS all-stars and don't understand all of the pitfalls of cascading, or designers that might not know the ins and outs of JavaScript, this kind of is a really nice way of having people being able to like onboard and kind of do styling and impacting the markup and not have to worry about kind of touching the code too much. And Vue still has this very kind of say component-centric approach, so you're not worrying about kind of say, I now have a massive entire page with nothing reusable, because Vue still kind of encourages you to try and like break things out into smaller reusable bits. So there's a few of these like say best practices that have kind of come around creating components and styling that Vue just kind of gently nudges you towards the right direction. But at the same time, if you want to have global CSS, that's there. If you want to do kind of shadow piercing, those are options. But they're things that you're not forced to learn up front. Kind of when you need them, you can. It's not, Vue isn't kind of like tossing all of these concepts on you right out of the gate. And also data binding, like this is kind of, I don't know, on track to kind of being the awfulness that Angular 1 was, where people get really complex expressions in their templates. I could have made a more real-world example, but it wouldn't fit within a slide. So yes, this is a very naive example. But kind of the nice thing is basically as you update things, the component state will reflect that, and you don't have to do much plumbing yourself. However, where the reactivity comes in is Vue has kind of the concept of computed properties. And what that means is basically under kind of that computed object before, you can write functions that will return values for, say, has matches, total matches. And you might be thinking, well, I can just write my own getter in Angular and I can get the same result, but will Angular be caching and memoizing those for you? Or RxJS and combined latest, like that's a whole lot to like try and understand if you're just wanting to kind of get rolling quickly. Or with React, it might be, yeah, well, if I use like React and Redux and reselect, I'm going to have highly memoized selectors. Like, but I just want to have a quick way of showing if I have matches or not. And in this way, it's kind of like, I think Vue does a really excellent job at providing this without giving too much burden onto the developer to understand this level of, like, say, detail and complexity. On the other hand, though, Vue does not force you into this box either. It's really extensible, and if you want to use Redux, you can. So it's not like it made this choice for you, you must follow or not use our framework. It's just kind of like, hey, handy tool. So kind of, I guess, the benefits of, say, going with the computed property, so that Vue will actually kind of take care of saying, well, this computed property is accessing these other things. It will only execute those functions if its kind of dependent properties change. So every time that the Vue re-renders, if the dependent properties have not changed, it's not going to execute that function. So if you had like a really expensive method within your computed property and something on your screen changed that did not impact it, you don't have to worry about taking on that performance hit. And you kind of get a bit of the benefits of, say, reactivity that observables bring without having to learn a really large framework to understand how to memoize and combine two values. And kind of, these are all like really easy things, and I could have had a more complex example. However, if there's, say, other inputs on the screen or data binding on the screen, if I had a property on the screen that, say, user's age, and user's age is not referenced in any of these properties, these functions are not going to rerun. Vue is going to be like, oh, I see that age updated. I'll go and update the age on the screen, but I'm not going to go and re-execute these. But if I change the filter, which the filter affects all of these will all go and rerun. So it's kind of a nice out-of-the-box performant way of kind of having that kind of derived data where you can kind of update a few things and other data just responds in kind of like doing a formula in an Excel spreadsheet. And I think it's kind of like this really kind of like narrow focus of trying to solve like just enough but not too much is what makes Vue a very approachable framework. So so you have this like kind of really core focus on components, templates, and data binding, so you don't have an entire ecosystem of knowledge that you have to try and absorb quickly. And this has kind of resulted in Vue having a very intuitive API. Going through their kind of dev docs and their guide, there's like a handful of methods that you have to learn. The built-in directives, there's like maybe like 15. There's like 3 or 4 built-in components. And their API find kind of gradually adapts to what you would need. Also, the developer experience of using Vue I found to be one of the most enjoyable ones that I've had in terms of like trying out a new framework, because it's my job to try and like try lots of different things. I was an early adopter of Angular 2, I've used React, I've used Angular 1, I've tried weird obscure frameworks and libraries, and something just about the experience of just trying to use Vue is just nice. It's kind of like a vacation for the like weird aspects of JavaScript that I'm tired of dealing with. It has excellent documentation, a great onboarding guide. The tooling for the Vue CLI is kind of just lightweight enough, but at the same time, if you want to go back to the days of like a script tag and an index.html, you can do that. You don't need to have an entire build chain to test out Vue. Now, if you want to build a real application, you want more than just a script tag and an index.html. But the fact that you can kind of go back to those like early days where it's like, oh, remember when we didn't have all this complexity just to build an application? Vue does allow that, but at the same time, you're not limited to that. And also, Vue is, I think, a very lightly opinionated framework where kind of say React has even less opinions, which is both a strength and a weakness, where it's like in React it's really easy to like build a component and they're like, well, how do I make this into an app? And React is, well, that's up to the community and ecosystem around it, which can be which I think is part of the strength of React, but can also be a big impact to how approachable it is. I've heard people say like, well, if you find React hard, you just don't know JavaScript, get good at JavaScript. But if you just need to get the job done, there is a decent balance in between where, yes, you do want to know JavaScript well. You can't just ignore that JavaScript is a thing. But it's nice if there's things that can kind of like ease things along. And then the next 2 things that I'm going to go into more in depth is I think Vue does an excellent job at kind of incremental complexity, where when you're kind of first getting started with Vue, you're not forced to learn a million different technologies and libraries and concepts just to kind of get running. But at the same time, as you get building applications, like either as your application gets more complex and has more needs, or you as a developer start to understand things better, Vue kind of has this nice way of gently exposing the complexity when you need it and not before. And also, I think there's just enough of like kind of like the thoughtful directives that make common tasks very easy. I know personally, I've kind of had a love-hate relationship with directives, mostly because of Angular 1, where directives in Angular 1 confused the heck out of me, especially when they were being overloaded to try and handle components. And so you're having like PTSD of like, I used directives in Angular 1, this is awful. Please do not let that sour your experience, because I think that they help a lot and in just the right way. So next thing that I'm going to kind of go into is how Vue handles incremental complexity. So for example, all you want to do is a simple hello world application. But you end up with a gorilla holding a banana, where you have really simple needs, and next thing you know, you're trying to figure out like Webpack and a build system and NPM and observables, and there's all this stuff, and like, oh, which package do I use for this or that? And you're like, I just want to do something really easy. And why do I have to like inherit all of this complexity up front when I might not need it yet, or I might need parts of that complexity, but not all of it all at once? So what I mean by this is that it is kind of ideas that are really simple and easy to use at first. They then build on, then you kind of learn new concepts as needed, and the things that you learn kind of naturally build off of the previous knowledge that you have learned. And for this, I'm going to like think of keeping in the spirit of like Vue and starting simple. Basically, I'm going to go to like one of the most basic things of basically how do you handle props or inputs into a component. And this might seem kind of trivial right now, but I think going through this is reflected throughout many areas of how Vue is built and its kind of mindset and approach to the framework and being able to scale. So kind of 5 common questions for props. It's like the first thing you do if you're building a component is like, well, what are my inputs? The next thing is, well, can I have some element of like type safety and ensure that like if I'm expecting a string, that I get a string? Then you might be thinking, can I flag things as required or not? Because maybe some things might be optional, but some things you might really want to have. And then, well, what if I want to have a default if users don't provide things? And then next we're thinking, can I validate the props? And you can do this in other frameworks also in various ways. But there's something about the elegance that Vue lets you do this that, and I'm like, that's just smart and nice and just nice. So instead of just like gushing about it, I will actually walk through these examples. So the first thing is basically, well, what are my props? I want to have a component where I want to know like an age, a name, and an active flag. So the most basic level is basically an array of strings. You're not having to learn all these other things to know what's going on. It's just, well, an array of strings, a very low-level basic concept. So you're like, all right, I have this array of strings, but what if I want to ensure that like age is a number and name is a string and is active is a Boolean? Well, that just kind of goes down to basically props being a object and kind of using like the built-in person, like you can now just say like age is number, name string, is active as a Boolean. And you're now starting to get a bit of like, say, type safety within your components without having to say introduce TypeScript or Flow. Although you can use TypeScript with Vue if you want, but you don't have to. And it's nice being able to kind of get a little bit of type checking without having to bring in an entire new transpiled language. So like, all right, this is pretty sweet. I can now like props goes from an array of strings to an object. What about if I want to make it a required? Again, the concept is, well, now the name is no longer just name with a value of string. Name is now an object. And the obvious name for that property is type. You're not making guesses of what that should be. And then also required, true, false. So this is just kind of showing how, as kind of like your requirements grow, as your like needs increase, it's just really easy to kind of start kind of layering these things on. The next thing is, can you provide defaults? Again, now that you have an object where you can put things like type and required, well, yeah, default false. And then the next thing is like, well, can I validate those inputs? And if you guess like, well, you can probably provide a function. Well, you can just call the function validator, and you can check the input value. And the nice thing about this is those functions are just normal functions. If you have a collection of like validation utility functions or highly composable functions that you want to reuse across the application, you don't have to worry about trying to wrap this up in some sort of like validation DI dependency injection system and registering them as a provider somewhere. It's just a nice logical spot to put them. And then even the errors are nice. I'm used to seeing some really awful, unhelpful error messages in my applications, and like that's just, I don't know. Maybe I've just felt too much pain in my days, but that just felt really nice. Like, oh, sweet. And lots of the error messages in Vue are actually like that. They'll kind of call out what went wrong. We'll even point you to links in their guides or docs. And it's not been very often that I've run into a completely incomprehensible stack trace in Vue. So the next thing that I'm going to talk to is basically forms suck. Like, I have been doing JavaScript and just development in general for years, and forms does not address JavaScript, C#, they suck, they're annoying. And also, dealing with DOM events suck, especially if you always have to do like, do I have to do event.prevent default every single time? And Vue helps make them suck less. And he looks pretty happy, and actually, I'm actually pretty happy using Vue. So where I'm going to go is this comes back to basically the directives that Vue provides. Conceptually, yeah, there's like little bits of reusable like DOM functionality. They don't need to clutter up the logic in your components, and they make kind of handling UI events easy, and also allow for really simple forms. So, for example, with the forms, like if you do a Google search for like React forms, the first result is the React official docs, and reading it makes me sad. I know everything that they're talking about. I know it. Just the default way of handling forms in React, it's kind of painful. Yes, if you use another like third-party library and things to help you out, it makes it easier. And then Angular, well, you get the gorilla holding a banana. There might be a time where you want that complexity, but up front, maybe not. And it's basically just like vModel equals message, and that will bind it to your component. If you want to ensure it's a number, you can do .number because there's something that people kind of often miss. If you put like type number onto a component, when it goes down into a black hole of the screen turning off, it comes out a string. So model.number, Vue will take care of actually converting that into a number for you. Likewise, if you want to kind of like trim the white space off of a string, it's often that you have to do this, so model.trim. But Vue doesn't want to say you must always trim every single string and do it for you automatically. You can kind of opt in. And at the same time, if you're thinking, I want more control over things, vModel is just a handy thing of saying, well, this is the value I want to bind to. When that value changes, I want to update things. So if you want to take that control back, you can. It's not like vModel is like locking you in. And if you want to break out of that box, it's really, really easy. So if you have a need of like not wanting that automatic two-way binding, just a really nice, handy way of being able to do that. And also for like event modifiers. And this is something that is not hard code, it's not complex code, it's just tedious code. And I can think of like a few ways of making kind of highly composable, reusable functions that I could just like plop in here instead, but do I want to? Do I have to? Do I have to do it again? Where with Vue, just kind of like really handy things like keyup.enter, keyup.print, just really nice ways of kind of like saying, well, I only want to do this if these other conditions are met. And when you're going through the docs, they just make sense, and it's not like you're having to guess what these things do. It's not like they're weird magic symbols. It's kind of like I want to like stop. I want to like stop the event, prevent the default, and respond to the enter key. So one thing that actually got me really excited, and like the things I've talked about before, feel like quality of life that just kind of makes normal things easier, which I don't think I can kind of underestimate the value of that, because when you're not having to deal with those like weird, awkward things now and then, you can be more productive. But something with Vue that kind of really made me go like, wow, like I know I could do this in Angular, but I'd probably spend a day doing it and still not know what was going on, is being able to have really easy, dynamic, data-driven UIs. And kind of what I mean by that is, at runtime, you might not always know what components you want to display on the screen. And then the screen goes black. And this is kind of say, if you ever had to build a form based off of, say, like a quiz engine or an API response tells you here's a schema for a form, you want to display it, dynamic workflows. There's lots of cases where I think having kind of the runtime to deciding what components to display when is really handy. So say if you want to have a data-driven form that is building up based off of like an API response, or let's say you want to swap out components dynamically based on the permissions that a user has. Or what if you're doing A/B testing and want to give group A this component and group B another one? Or being able to easily kind of like toggle features where maybe for a while version 1 of a feature goes out, then maybe v2 later on. And Vue makes things like this so easy that I'm kind of geeking out about what I could be doing with it. And the kind of magic behind this, though, is kind of one of the special components in Vue, of which there's like 3, is component. And the really nice thing about this is the component binds to like is. And this is basically to tell me, well, what do I want this component to be? You could like hard code a thing there, but that property could be bound to a prop that you've passed in. It can be a property on your data, or it could be a result of a computed value. And what this basically does is Vue will go and see, well, what is the component for it, and put it in place. And a really basic example, and the thing that really impressed me is things like passing down props, models, events, worked as I would expect. I didn't have, because I was like, well, if I put an ng4 onto this, will this work? It did. Can I pass props down and have like them just get They do. Can I emit events and listen to them? Yes, you can. That just worked in a way that I was shocked it was that easy. I've been used to the pain points of trying to have things be this dynamic and kind of been like, why is it so hard? It does not need to be. So kind of the logic in the backing component is I have is fancy, true or false, and that's what kind of toggles the switch. And before you say like is, component is current mode. Current mode is the computed property that is swapping between, say, a fancy input and a simple one. And at the most basic, is you can swap between and now switch to the other component. And I can swap it back. And the fact that like it kept on to like the data, the model was really easy. And it's like, well, that's a fun party trick, but do I need something that basic? So I got thinking, can I extend this to like building a dynamic form generator? Something that has made me very sad in the past. And this is kind of something I did maybe in like a span of like 2 hours, and mostly going off of my intuition of how Vue works. Is I had this idea, well, I'm going to provide a schema, and I'll go into the schema later, and loop over it, and basically dynamically swap out the components based on that schema. And there's a few things that I bind to like pass in, but this is kind of like the heart of the form generator. And the backing code for it is, well, I have kind of fancy input, simple input, currency input. I will get to this sweet thing later, but lazy loading is super easy. And likewise, I have like a props of a schema and value, and a very basic kind of like every time things change, it aims thing to update the top level model. So the model that you've bound to will now reflect what you've done. Then to actually use it within the template, a very simple tag. And I guess I apologize for not explaining, I guess, how this like colon schema equals. This is basically a shorthand of saying I want to bind a property to this, of which you could use like vbind if you want. I apologize for not maybe explaining what that was actually doing. I'm sorry. Anyways, and then the schema is like very basic. I have like the model that I want to be updating, and then the schema is basically type fancy input, the label I want, and so on. And then also I have a currency input, total and so on, and then I pass in a list of currencies. And the thing that is nice is that when this is being passed down as props to the other components, if say fancy input isn't expecting currencies, things won't pull up. It just kind of ignores it. It's not going to complain, I don't know what this currency prop is. I hate you, I'm dying. And it's like, oh, whatever, currency's currency, I don't care about it, I won't complain. And so it kind of embraces a bit of like the actual dynamic nature of JavaScript and not trying to make it this really statically analyzable language. There's pros and cons to that side, but the thing that I tried to be to JavaScript was embracing that dynamic nature. And kind of in use to kind of show how it runs. And I now kind of, this one just goes through and makes all input types to fancy input. So that currency and that change. And then I go back, and then basically, you can see as I change, say, the currency value, swap back and forth, and it will have kind of the correct currency symbol. And then when I go back, and this was, honestly, still don't quite know how I do this in Angular with lazy loading also of each component. And I've been using Angular for a long time. And this brings me on to lazy loading that I'm getting kind of close to my time slot, so I'm almost done. But basically why I like lazy loading is good is it can help reduce load times of your application. And you can also load what you need when you need it. And you can also get a really high level of control of what loads when. So if you have, I guess the common use case, say the landing page of a website, you kind of just want to load the above the fold stuff. You don't want to load every single thing. And one of my kind of current pet peeves on every website I go to is I get a little chat widget asking me, how can I help you? I'm like, A, you can't help me right now, and B, why am I loading this thing when I haven't asked you to? Where Vue makes it so easy that if you wanted to lazy load that whole chat widget when they click on chat, that's super easy. So I guess why is Vue good at being lazy? And it's to me, it's so easy, it's almost boring. If you haven't felt the pain of trying to get lazy loading working before, especially before, say, React Create App kind of has good support for it, or Angular CLI, this kind of seems obvious. And the thing that is really nice, though, is that Vue is not just lazy loading on a per route level, but also on a per component and kind of when you want it. And the thing that is nice is for a route with a lazy route, just provide a function that uses kind of the standard import syntax, and the Webpack config will take care of going through and just having that work. You don't have to have kind of special symbols after your statements. You just expect it to kind of work that way. And Vue also has kind of a nice helpers that if you wanted to have a loading component to show in its place, really easy to do. If you wanted to have something that would show an error if it failed to load, those are just kind of really easy building blocks on top of this. And something that I like is you can do kind of per component lazy loading. So for example, I'm not going to go through and show the network traffic because I'm getting low on time. But if you're to land on this route, and I do have a demo repo up that the links are at the end of this deck, is when you kind of click on this, it will then go and fetch the bundle for this. And I'm kind of thinking that there is a lot of potential behind this level of control. For example, if you're kind of, scrolling down a page and want to start lazy loading stuff as the user kind of gets closer to that viewport, you can offload those things. Being able to kind of have it be that reactive, or if a property changes, you could say, I want to lazy load this now. The fact that it's that easy is kind of impressive, and for the most part, it just works without having to kind of think about too much crazy magic things. And finally, I think that Vue is kind of an incredibly flexible and scalable framework. And this is my second last slide, but for example, some people love JSX, and they kind of really hate the idea of having templates. And with Vue, if you wanted to, you can provide your own render function to a component. So if you get to a case where the template abstraction is getting in your way, and you're doing really weird things, and trying to work around the limitations that kind of come with that, Vue is like, well, here, you can provide your own render and go as like low level as using create element. But if you want to use JSX also, that is also an option. So you're not being locked into one pattern. I think it's going to be like so many use cases where templates are appropriate. But when you do want to have that level of control, that option is there. And likewise, it can help scale with complexity as needed. They have an official routing package called Vue Router, but they also don't force you into it. I've seen examples that have used Express Router with Vue just because. I've seen examples using just HTML5 push state and a very minimal router. So these are officially supported packages, but they're not kind of forced upon you. But they have the same quality of documentation, onboarding experience, and the same clean conceptual API that the core library has. And also for state management, which is going to be the topic of the next talk, because like as your applications grow, managing a state gets really hard. You can use Vuex if you want, but if you wanted to like roll your own, you can. If you wanted to use Redux, you can. But the core team does have the Vuex library, and kind of Vue is aware that it is within a Vue application, and it makes a few things to make using state management in Vue easier, and that will be the next talk after this. So thank you for your time. There's a lot more I wanted to get to, but I'm surprised I managed to fit that into 40 minutes. You can find me on Twitter, E_P882, at GitHub, eSchultz, and the code examples is /Vue Meetup example. Thank you.
That was really cool. I was quite taken by the form builder example.
That is the easiest form builder I've ever built, ever. And it was easy it seems like it shouldn't be.
Cool. So we're going to do a 5-minute break, and then afterwards, Hassan will tell us more about Vuex. So this is going to be a little bit more of an advanced topic that is going to give us into, because you cannot really build a very complex application without a state management solution. And so I'm super excited hearing Hassan's explanation of how to achieve that with Vuex. So 5 minutes, then back. Thanks.
Fold it up, we gon' burn it down.
So we are going to move on to part 2. We wanted to make sure that for the first meetup would be a total success, and that's why we decided to bring you the best. one of the most exciting topics there could be. Seriously, I mean it. I'm not being sarcastic. State management. No, because you cannot really, it's like when you start moving from really simple apps to more complicated ones, you have to figure out how to manage your state. And that's why I'm really excited in presenting Hassan, who is going to talk about state management in Vue.
Awesome. Hey everyone, my name is Hassan Djirdeh. I'm a front-end developer at Shopify here in Toronto, and today I'm going to be talking about state management in Vue.js. For those who may be a little confused, I have a twin brother that works at Rangle. That's back there, just in case that some don't really know that yet. So Evan gave a fantastic introduction to the Vue library, and one of the things he talked about was Vue components. Vue components are decoupled units of functionality that's necessary for the organization of our entire application. With Vue components, we basically couple our markup, logic, and styles. And there's pretty much two different ways to define components. In standalone Vue applications, you can actually just use the Vue function. You specify Vue.component, the name of the component, and all the options that the component needs. In pre-compiled Vue applications that use Browserify or Webpack, and use the Vue loader library, just like Evan showed, you can actually define your components in a single file format. This format is basically defining components in a .vue file and basically marking your markup in a template section, your JS in a script section, and your styles within a style section. Whether we're defining our components globally or whether we're actually using a single file format, at some points when we're building an application, you have to manage data. Now this is a pretty broad topic, so we're going to start off very basic. Let's assume we have a hypothetical application here. And all we have just yet is a parent component and a child component. How do we go about passing data from the parent down to the child? Evan talked about this briefly, and you can use props. Here's going to be a very brief and quick example of how props can be used. On the left-hand side, we have a component named parent component, and all it basically does is in its template, it renders another component called child component. As it's rendering the child component, it's passing a prop labeled company. This company prop is given a string value of Rangle. All the child component needs to do is declare that prop within a props property, and in this particular instance, it's basically using the mustache syntax to bind that prop value onto the template. So this basically is two components that has a single H1 element that says hello Rangle. Pretty straightforward. Regardless of how big your Vue application gets, using props for the most part remains the same. Now how do we go about passing information in the opposite direction? How do we pass information from the child up to the parents? We can't use props for this. For Vue, they actually provide us with custom events. Vue custom events behave very similar to JavaScript native custom events, with one key distinction. Vue custom events are primarily used for component communication as opposed to communication between DOM nodes. So let's go through a very brief example of this as well. On the left-hand side, we have a child component, and in its template exists a click event listener. This click event listener is denoted by the @click syntax. When the user clicks this header element, he or she calls a change speaker method. If you look at the change speaker method of the component, it uses the component's events interface to emit a custom event. What's the name of the custom event? It's the change speaker. Now on the parent component side, and its template is declaring the child component. In addition, it actually has the custom event listener as specified as @change_speaker. So basically, when this custom event is fired within the child component, this listener is triggered and calls a parent's change speaker method. What is this change speaker method doing? It's changing the parent component's speaker value from Hassan to Evan. So basically, these two components, when the user actually sees, is basically a header element that says, hello, Hassan. When he or she clicks it, it changes to say, hello, Evan. So this is a little bit of overkill to use a custom event for it, but this is a very good example of how custom events can be used. In addition, custom events actually allow us to pass data. In the second argument, we can actually pass data in our custom event. And custom event listeners don't have to be specified on the template. They can actually be specified programmatically within the component instance. So far, it's pretty straightforward. We use props to pass information down, and we use custom events to pass information up. But what if we actually introduce another component into our application? Let's assume this component was the child of the parent component and a sibling to the first child component. If we need to pass information from the parent component downwards, we can use props. There's no big deal there. But what if we wanted the child components 1 and 2 to interact with one another? Can we use custom events for this? We can't. When we declared the first custom event trigger, we were declaring it within the scope of the child component. And as a result, we had to declare the custom event listener where the child component was being declared. Because of this, since 2 sibling components are completely isolated from each other, you can't declare the custom event listener on one of their templates. So what do we do here? So this is the moments in which you start to think, okay, how do I actually manage data in my application as I introduce more and more components? Vue provides a couple of different ways for this, but they can be sort of categorized into 3 main ways. We can use a global event bus. We can use a simple form of state management. Or we can use the Flux-like library, Vuex. I'm going to talk about the first 2 points because they're fairly important, but they'll be brief. Then I'm going to dive in deep into what Vuex is and how to use it. So, in essence, an event bus is a Vue instance that is used to enable isolated components to subscribe and publish custom events between each other. There's 2 key things here. An event bus is a Vue instance. Vue components are Vue instances. Every Vue instance has their own inbuilt custom events interface. An event bus is a new Vue instance that is used primarily for its custom events interface. How does it allow isolated components to be used between each other? An event bus is often declared globally for this purpose. So let's assume we had a global event bus, and we had a sibling component or a completely random component in our application. Let's assume there was a method in the component called emit_event that, when triggered, uses the event bus interface to emit a new event. Another component, completely unrelated, within its created hook can have an event bus listener. For those who may not know, the created hook is a lifecycle hook of the component. It basically gets fired when the component gets rendered. So what's happening here is basically when that component gets rendered, the event bus creates an event listener to say, whenever this particular event gets fired, do something. And in this case, it fires a console log message. And this exists throughout the life of that component until it's destroyed. So remember how our first child component communicated with the parent component? We don't have to use the child component's custom events interface anymore. We can use the event bus. And between the 2 child components, an event bus works well. So far, so good. Now, the thing is, most applications don't look like this. They look a little bit more like this. And this is actually fairly simple. Let's assume we had a parent component and just numerous child components in our application. And let's just say all those white lines were props that was being passed down. Assume component 1.1 on the left-hand side here needed to actually communicate with the parent component. It'll fire a custom event, and the parent component will create a custom event listener. Okay. What if components 1.2 needed to do the same thing? Okay. Components 2 and 3 needed to interact with each other. You see what's starting to happen here. Though incredibly easy to set up, an event bus gets hard to track very quickly. If you look at the Vue.js style guide, it's actually recommended to not use an event bus for global application-wide management. And this is the reason why. Okay, so we know how an event bus works. Let's move on to something else. When a Vue application gets rendered, there has to be an uppermost parent component. So why don't we move all application-level data up to this component? And we can just simply use props to pass all this information down to every single child component. All we'll need to do technically is somehow use the child components to alert the parent components in certain instances to change the parent component data values. Now, Vue has a special reactivity system. For every component that has a changed data value, it would automatically re-render to reflect this. So as a result, over here, we don't need custom events or anything like this. So this process of centralizing states in one area and centralizing all state changes in one area can be understood to be a simple form of state management. So state management, what is that? State management is the management of application-level data. This may not seem like anything, but the bolded part is actually important. Application-level data is data that needs to be shared in multiple parts of your application. This is where we care about state management. Component-level data should live and only live within your components. You don't care about where it should be in the rest of your application. The component will take care of it. Now, instead of using a parent component to host your application-level data, why don't we externalize it to a store? A store could be an object, a class, that has 2 main things. It has your application-level state. Let's assume, in this particular example, the details of this talk is what we need in our application. And the second key thing, it has methods dedicated to changing the application state. Here, we have a change speaker method that expects a payload, and with this payload, directly updates the state speaker value. So that's an example of how this works very quickly. So on the top left hand, we have the store, just for reference's sake, and we're going to have two components interact with one another. Component A is simply going to create a copy of the store state as a shared state object, and its purpose is to display the speaker value in the shared state object. So all it says is this speaker is, if you look back at our store, Hassan Djirdeh. Component B, a completely unrelated component, is going to affect what component A displays. So when we say component B communicates with component A, that word is used loosely. It's not going to do anything to component A directly. It's going to go through the store to do this. So we have a change speaker method in component B. And that change speaker method can be fired through anything. It could be a click event, a keyboard event, it doesn't matter. But when that event is fired, it's going to call the store change speaker method and pass a payload of Evan Schultz. And as a result, when that method gets fired, the speaker value will actually change in component A. So there's two very important things to really hit home here. The first is we're mutating store state directly. Now, for those who come from a React or Redux background, this is actually a little foreign. In React or Redux, state is treated as immutable. You have to replace state entirely. In Vue, state is treated as reactive. You can manipulate state directly, and components will recognize this and directly re-render. The second thing isn't something that is apparent, but something that has to be enforced. When we start building more and more state changes or state mutations, we want to keep them all within the store. This is especially important to make this approach better than, say, an event bus. Now, for any other person in your team, a developer of sorts, can come at this and simply see all the states in your application and all the state changes that can be done in your application. Remember the hypothetical application we had before? We don't have custom events being sporadically emitted anymore, and we don't have to rely on props to pass all information from the parent component down. We could in certain cases, but in other cases for components that actually depend on the store state, we can allow them to focus on the store. Let's now focus primarily on what's happening here on the store elements. In component B, there's a particular method and it has a particular responsibility. Its responsibility is to call the store change speaker method. So we can say it's a store action. In the store change speaker method, it has one responsibility. Its responsibility is to directly mutate store state. So we can say this is a store mutation. So we can basically say when component B gets fired, it's an action triggering or committing to a mutation. Component A doesn't care about what component B is doing. It doesn't care about the store. It has one purpose. It's just simply displaying the information that it needs. And how is it doing that? It's getting the value it needs. It's getting the state values, and it's displaying the speaker value. So of sorts, we can say it's a getter. Now, we're starting to move very close to the Flux-like principle of managing data. And in addition, as you can see, this is all this for just one particular trigger or change. What if we had multiple actions, multiple mutations? Wouldn't it be nice if we can start segmenting this into more concrete objects that can grow as your application grows? This is exactly where Vuex comes in. Vuex is a Flux-like state management library built solely for use with Vue. So Flux, what is Flux? For those who may not know, Flux is a design pattern created by Facebook. The Flux pattern consists of 4 parts organized as a one-way data pipeline: action, dispatcher, store, view. Now, in the Vuex terminology, I'll explain how it works. The view or components call actions. Actions commit to store mutations. Store mutations mutate store state. When that happens, the view re-renders. But we're going to be talking about each of these in more detail. Now, Vuex is a library. It has to be introduced into your application. That can be done through NPM, Yarn, a content delivery network. And for module-based systems, Vuex has to be explicitly installed. So that basically you have to specify Vue, use Vuex. Now, the heart of a Vuex integration is the Vuex store. Declaring a Vuex store can be done by saying vuex.store and passing in the pieces that make up the store. There are 4 pieces that fully define a Vuex store: state, mutations, actions, and getters. State and mutations are necessary to make the Vuex store. You cannot create a store without one of these elements. Actions and getters aren't necessary, but are vital to actually take the benefits of Vuex. So let's assume we have a store created. How do we have our store accessible everywhere in our Vue application? Like the store is the heart of a Vuex integration, the Vue instance is the heart of a Vue application. is where we render our uppermost parent component and where we basically specify the DOM element in which we're going to be mounting our entire Vue application. So here, for example, let's assume we have a DOM element with an ID of app that our Vue application is going to be mounted upon. And let's assume we're going to be rendering a parent component labeled app. In this case, we're passing in the store object into our Vue instance. So now we have an idea of how to integrate Vuex into our application. Let's talk about each of the pieces of a Vuex store. State. State is simply an object. I've mentioned it before, but state is just basically an object of all the application level data. For this example, let's keep with what we had before, and it's the details of this particular talk. Mutations. Now, mutations are functions that are responsible in directly mutating store state. Now, mutation functions consist of a string type and a handler. Mutation string types are often declared in capital letters to basically distinguish them from other functions and for tooling or linting purposes. This is sort of a flux-like principle. Mutation handlers always have access to state as their first argument. In addition, when actions commit to mutations, they may or may not pass in a payload. With this particular example, we have an update speaker mutation that's expecting a payload, and it's going to be updating the speaker value in our state with that payload. Actions exist to call mutations. In addition, actions are responsible in performing any or all asynchronous calls prior to committing to a mutation. Here we have an action labeled update speaker. There's a few things happening here, so I'm going to break this step by step. If you've noticed, this particular action has the same name as the mutation it's going to be committing to. This isn't a hard requirement or a must, but it's common sense to basically say, okay, since we have an update speaker action, it's probably going to commit to the update speaker mutation. Now, actions don't have to commit to a single mutation, though. They could commit to one or more mutations. Like mutations, actions have access to a particular object automatically. But in this case, they have access to an object often labeled as the context object. This context object gives them access to a few different things. It gives them access to state with context.state. It gives them access to the Vuex getters with context.getters. And it gives them access to the commit function, context.commit, that has to be used to commit to a mutation. In this particular case, let's assume we don't need state or getters. We're only going to be committing to the mutation. As mentioned, actions are responsible in performing any or all asynchronous calls. So let's assume there was an API call that we needed to hit for this action. We're going to be using the Axios library for this. Axios is just an HTTP library for GET or POST requests. Doesn't matter what we use. But we're basically saying make a GET request to API speakers, and with the response, commit to the update speaker mutation. What are we passing in the second argument? We're passing in the payload that the update speaker mutation expects. Let's assume there was a speaker value in a data object within an array. Doesn't really matter. Now, the last piece of Vuex store is getters. Now, Vuex getters are to a Vuex store what computer properties are to a Vue component. Now, for those who may not know, computer properties and components are primarily used to make some form of manipulation to values prior to displaying it to the view. Vuex getters sort of plays a very similar role. We basically can use Vuex getters to make any form of manipulation to the store state just for presentational purposes. We can basically say, okay, we need some form of the speaker value or some form of this property before taking it to components. This is why getters don't have to be used. If you need to directly get state values, you can often do that from components. There's no problems there. Personally, this is a personal preference. I use getters for everything. I basically set up getters for every state information we need in our Vuex store. So over here, we have a get speaker getter. Like mutations, getters have access to the state object automatically. So here, we're basically saying return the speaker value from the state. So now that we have an idea of basically how a Vuex store is integrated, how basically all the pieces of a Vuex store work, what do components have to do? With a very strong Vuex store, components often have one of two things. All they need to do is basically get state data. This can be done through getters or directly from the states. Or they can just basically dispatch actions. That's all they do. Let's see an example of how this basically works. Here we have a single file component, though it's slightly different than what I was showing, but the concept is the same. And in its template exists a click event listener. When this click event listener is triggered, it calls an update speaker method within the component. In addition, the text content within the header element says the speaker is mustache syntax get speaker. So right away, we know get speaker is a variable or a computer property within the component. In our script element, we can see we're exporting a component of the name speaker component. Now, in the computer property, we can see the get speaker computer property. This property is being used in a template. And what is it doing? It's basically returning the results of the get speaker Vuex getter. In other words, it's mapping the get speaker Vuex getter onto the component get speaker computer property. And in the methods, we can see something very similar. There exists an update speaker method that, when triggered, it basically simply dispatches the update speaker action. Doesn't do anything else. It lets the Vuex store deal with everything else. If you've noticed, we're accessing the store by saying this.store. And we're also using the $sign as well. This is basically the store that is available everywhere in our Vue application. This is basically the store that we passed in to our Vue application. Now, one thing that tends to happen is when you start accessing information from the store, we start specifying the words this.store often. So we say this.store.getters to get getters, this.store.dispatch, dispatch actions. Vuex recognizes that this might be a bit wordy, so they provide helpers to make things easier. Here, we're basically importing two helpers from Vuex called map getters and map actions. And in our computer property, we're basically saying map whatever getter that has the name of getSpeaker onto this component that has a particular computer property called getSpeaker. We don't have to say this.store.getters, no. It's directly understood that we're mapping one-to-one. And in our methods, we're doing the same thing. We're mapping whatever store update speaker action exists to a component's update speaker method. This is the same as the step before, but it's just a little bit easier when it comes to readability. So let's walk through exactly what would happen in that component. Initially, our state speaker value was Hassan Djirdeh, if anyone remembers. If a user actually clicks the header element, it dispatches the update speaker store action. What does the update speaker store action does? It basically performs a get call that's needed, and with the response, commits to the update speaker mutation. Let's assume that value we're passing in is Evan Schultz. That update speaker mutation is called, and basically commits, or basically updates the state speaker value to what we intended, Evan Schultz. So the thing is, when a user basically uses an application, he doesn't recognize all this is happening. He or she, for the most part, is basically seeing that, oh, there's a header element or something being displayed that said the speaker is Hassan Djirdeh. When he or she clicks it, an asynchronous call is made, and when complete, it changes something else. If you've noticed, there's a lot of extra boilerplates and steps we're taking to make this happen. For simple applications, it may not be necessary. But as an application grows, this is why we're deliberately doing it. Vuex wants us to track every single thing. We want to track the actions that are happening, the mutations that are causing, and the state changes that are being done, because this is what basically the state management library that keeps it structured as your application grows. So if you think about it, Vuex simply extends the simple store state management principle by doing one thing in particular. It introduces explicitly defined getters, mutations, and actions. This is the main thing that it's doing. In addition, it actually integrates directly with the Vue dev tools for time travel debugging. So I'm going to show you a very quick demo of this. So here's a shopping cart application I built a week or two ago that it's a Vuex, the colors aren't that good, but it's a Vuex integrated Vue application, and all the calls that are being done are persisted to the server. For those who may not know, the Vue dev tools is basically a Chrome extension or a Firefox add-on. And it provides such easy steps to debug your Vue application. So basically, over here, I can basically see, hopefully everyone can see this, that I'm looking at the cart list component on the left-hand side. I'm looking at a product list component that I've created. Within product list, I can see multiple product list item components. When I click a particular product list item component, I can see the props being passed in detail. So Vue dev tools are just necessary when you're building applications in Vue. Now, the good thing about Vuex is it integrates automatically to the Vue dev tools. So over here, I'm going to be creating a few calls and mutations. Every time I add an item to a cart, a mutation is called. And this particular mutation is called update cart items. So I can keep doing this. I can add multiple things, boom, 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 make it look nice, and I can remove everything in my cart. So what Vue dev tools does is it allows us to time travel to a particular mutation. When we time travel, our UI actually updates to show us how the UI looks at that very moment. In addition, we can see information about our Vuex store at that spot. We can see the state in that particular time. We can see the getters that are being retrieved or can be retrieved. We can see the mutation and what payloads it's actually being passed in. So you can see how useful this is when you're trying to basically find a bug or something wrong in your Vuex or Vue application. Everything is tracked. Another important thing is every single time I call a mutation is being shown here. Mutations in Vuex are actually synchronous in nature. They happen one by one by one. Let's go back to this. I had some GIFs in case things didn't work. So basically, through this entire talk, we talked about a few different ways to manage application data. We talked about basically using a simple form state management. We talked about the Flux-like library Vuex. And we talked even about using a global event system, often understood to be an event bus. Now, some of you may be thinking who are not familiar with this yet, what is the correct or wrong approach? There is none. There's no right or wrong way. Each of these ways have their appropriate benefits and have some issues associated with them. An event bus is easy to set up. It's direct, but things get hard to track over time. A simple store sort of helps there, but as your application grows, you don't have explicitly defined getters, actions, mutations. Vuex is guaranteed to be the most robust and structured, but it comes a lot of additional boilerplate. Does all applications need it? Not necessarily. There's a lot more that can be talked about Vuex, but this was my goal for this particular talk, was to basically give you guys a good rundown of state management in general and why or how Vuex can be used. That's my Twitter handle there, Djirdeh. I'm trying to up my Twitter game, so holla at me, guys. Thank you. Hopefully that was useful. I'll be around here for as long as everyone is. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And I'm not sure how questions work, but I'm happy to answer questions at this very moment. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Oh, wait.
Wait, apparently, wait.
Oh, sorry.
The mic's coming.
We want everyone to be able to hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello, can you
Hello.
hear me? Yeah, in one of the first slides you
Yes.
had
Yeah.
two examples of how Vue components are designed.
Yeah.
And
go
so
back
there
to
was a special
Yeah.
property for template.
Yes.
I'm curious about CSS. Where would you
So
keep CSS?
this is the one, it's a very good question actually. So this is the one downside of, one of the major downsides of using just simple Vue.component to declare components. If you were to define CSS variables, you'd have to define it like normal. You have to use a CSS file of sorts, declare it separately, but the template here will have to be basically accepting all CSS. So you can define your classes and IDs here, but you can't define your styles. But that's one of the really good benefits of using a single file component. It's incredibly easy just to define your CSS there. You can scope your CSS to be only within that component, and everything is set up. The downside of that is you have to have a bundling system for your application. Your application has to have Webpack or Browserify, and it has to have a Vue loader library to make that happen. But yeah, it's a very good question, actually.
Two, but they're both quick. The first is, with time travel, does that track everything through the whole life of your application, or only while you have the Vue tools open?
If I'm not mistaken, it's only when you have your Vue tools open.
That makes sense.
You can actually verify, actually.
Yeah, that's
yeah, it's only when
cool.
your Vue tools are open.
It's
So if I
incredibly cool.
close it.
And
Yeah.
then the other is
Read
when you
out your second
imported the
Yes.
map getters
Yes.
and map actions,
Yes.
you passed an array to it of strings. You just keep adding strings for all the different things
It's
you
a
wanted to
very
map,
good question,
right?
actually. Let me go to that slide really quickly. I think it would be easier if somebody actually sees it. So, yeah, so it's a very good point. Exactly. You can pretty much specify as many getters as you need, just like a normal array. But the thing is we're doing here is our mutation and our component method and our getter has the same name. So if they were of different names, we'd have to specify it here. We'd have to say the get speaker getter is going to be mapped to something else here. But yeah, otherwise you just pass it directly and it's effortless.
Is there anything where it'll just like read all the different things you have in your state and then just put the word get in front of all of them for you?
I'm sure a library like that exists. And if it's not, I think it could be made.
Okay.
But no, natively it doesn't do that. Yeah,
Thank
good
you.
question though. Thank you. The clone.
Oh.
I don't know. I know he's gonna ask me. I'm nervous now. Oh my god, snap. Get out
Yeah. He just said, can you ask a question to yourself? So I've never used Vue or Vuex myself, and using React and Redux, one of the things a lot of people I hear often is that immutability is so important. Have you noticed any issues with store not being immutable?
It's actually a very, very good question. So just like data values within components are sort of treated reactive, states within Vuex is treated reactive as well. When you pass in your Vuex store, everything's automatically reactive. You don't have to worry about replacing your entire store state or anything like that. This is why mutations within the Vuex store does the same thing. We directly update states, and everything works as is. Components will understand that something's been changed, and will re-render to accommodate this. It's a good question, actually. Yeah. Awesome. I'm still here for the rest of the night, guys, so feel free to speak to me later. Thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you to Rangle folks. Sorry, yeah, feel free to take it.
Thank you all so much for coming to our first Vue meetup. Hopefully we see you at the following Vue meetups that we don't have dates for yet, but soon. Just a couple really quick housekeeping things, and then I'll let you run off to more pizza and beer. We have a couple dates for you. January 29th, we're hosting Marketing TO. February 5th, we're hosting Travel Tech TO, and February 6th, we're hosting Civic Tech TO. All those will be in this office, so come on out for those. We are hiring, so if you're interested in working for Rangle, Yuri's there in the back. Feel free to go and chat with him. I'll tell you all about the roles that we have available. Another piece, if you're interested in partnering with Rangle professionally through your work, come and find me. I'll be here for a little bit as well. I can chat about that process. I'd like to say thanks to Hassan and Evan so much for talking. Can we give them a round? And other than that, we have a little bit of time to network, so make some friends. There's more beer, there's more pizza, and that's all. Thanks again. Take care.